All right, our recording is in progress, and as far as I
Awesome.
know, this is Life in 10 Minutes podcast number one, draft number
Yeah.
one, whatever we want to call it. Valley, it's great to have you.
Oh, Jonathan, it's great to see you. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm personally just stoked. This is something you've kind of floated to me, the idea of a podcast, and something I love so much about Life in 10 is it's like just go for it, just do it. Like I don't know if
Right.
we have the right recording equipment or whatever, but
It
here
doesn't
we are.
matter. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think life in 10 minutes, or really any kind of writing experience, really lends itself to the audio experience too.
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
it's not just about writing, it's also about reading your work out loud, hearing it read out loud,
yeah.
and then being able to share it with other people. So the listening experience is really as important as the writing experience in so many ways.
Hey.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what do you notice with that in terms of how people read? Yeah, obviously we all pick up on each other's reading habit or writing habits and talk about that a little bit, but I'm sure you're also noticing people's reading habits.
Yeah. Something really just incredibly different happens for people. They might be writing about something that's very emotional or a big experience from their past. But nine times out of 10, they don't feel that emotion in the same way, in a real way, until they read it out loud. And that's when you see people start to have their body has a physical reaction. The crying, the heat comes up when they're reading it rather than when they're writing it. It brings it to life in just a completely different way. Plus, some people's stories, their voices feel like such an integral part, their literal speaking voice is such an integral part of the story itself. People can really animate their stories in a way that maybe no one else could for them, or that when you're reading it on the page, it just doesn't come across the same way.
Yeah, I think about that for myself for sure, that like the act of reading is a pretty critical step in the process. And sometimes I find myself the same way I would draft a new piece of writing or like tweak some words, it's like if I were to read that again, I would read it differently. I would put my emphasis different, that kind of
Absolutely.
thing.
Yes. That's so true. Because when I read something out loud, I understand what I'm trying to say in a different way than when I'm writing, because writing is kind of that stream of consciousness where you're kind of letting go of the thinking brain and you're just trying to kind of allow what's coming to come out of you. But when you hear it, you process it in a different way. And when I'm reading things back to myself, I often change some words, change the way things sound a little bit because I realize that's going to sound more natural coming out of my mouth.
Yeah.
And so we bring it, it's like being animated. It's like Frankenstein's all these parts laying together on the table versus that breath of air with the electricity, and he comes to life.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. It brings
Yeah.
it to life. I know something for me, well, let me ask it this way. You've offered before, like I was in your sacred circle this past Saturday at your house, and you said, you have the option to not read what you wrote. You can just discuss what you wrote and tell us a little bit about it. And I've heard you say it before, but I've never been with anybody actually like skip the reading process. Uh,
Yeah.
do people do that often?
No, it's very rare that people skip the reading process. I think a lot of people think they want to skip it
Yes.
and they're like, "Oh my God, this is terrifying. I don't want to read it." But then when they start hearing other people read their pieces, they begin to understand what a huge gift it is on both ends, both to be the listener and the receiver, and to be the reader. And because it's a way of really opening your heart up in a very vulnerable way. When we talk about something, we're a few steps removed from the actual writing of it. And I mean, I'd say 999 times out of 1,000, people do end up reading
Yeah.
their work. And there are a few circumstances where people have asked not to read it, and I just completely understand that. I respect
Yeah,
that.
of
Yeah.
course. I uh I ask because like, I guess I've picked up on that with my own classes too, where sometimes telling people that you're gonna read what you wrote feels like the step that's the hardest sell. Like people squirm a little bit. But then,
Yeah.
like you said, I think I think there's something in us that really wants our stories to be told and wants to live in a world where we can tell them.
It's so
Uh,
true. Yeah.
yeah,
We do. We want to be seen. And we don't want to be seen. And we want to be seen. And we don't want to be seen. So like stepping out into that. And once you do it and you realize that no one around you has died because they've listened to your story, it starts to open this little thing up in you where it becomes safer and safer and safer.
yeah,
If it is a safe and non-judgmental space where we can tell more and more and more about ourselves, truth, and then we're not hiding it. It really is like a release valve for shame.
yeah. I think
When we
so.
open up, we just start to accept ourselves more as we see other people. And even if they don't comment, it's just even that quiet presence of other people listening and just maintaining their own quiet presence. There's something that really, some of that hot, scared, shameful energy just dissolves in that presence.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Seeing each other and seeing ourselves. What do you make of the really common habit of picking up their notebook to read and saying, "I'm sorry," or
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
this isn't any good. This isn't complete, but I'm going to read it anyway."
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it's sort of an instinct in a way that maybe we all have because we still have this expectation that it should be good, that it's supposed to be good, where actually the truth is we will probably never be able to judge our own writing accurately. We do not have an objective lens about our own writing. It's purely subjective. And most of the time, we are far harder on ourselves than we would be on anyone else. So we have this we think our writing is down here. And so we want to apologize for it. And so often what happens is after you read it, you're like, that wasn't even what I thought it was going to be.
Yeah,
I thought I wrote something different. And um, so I do try to encourage people to skip the apologizing part because what we're trying to do is practice that acceptance of ourselves. And when we're apologizing, that's not really an act of acceptance of our
right.
writing and who we are. It's like, so it's hard, and I think maybe I don't know if it's more with women or what, but there is just across the board a tendency for some people to apologize, even just for being alive or taking up space.
Yeah,
And so if we can practice not apologizing in this setting, it can translate to other settings as
yeah,
well.
yeah. Right. I think so many of us, like, if we were out in the middle of the night, you know, on a December evening, we would apologize for asking for a blanket, like,
That's true.
yeah, like
Maybe it's
I'm
like a,
sorry, but could I have a blanket?
yeah, and maybe it's not just women. Maybe it's just anybody who doesn't feel like their needs are valuable, that their worth isn't quite high enough to just be able to exist with what you need.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we live in a world that sort of says, here's what your needs ought to be,
Right.
and they ought to look sort of like whatever the magazine at the grocery store says they ought to look like, or whatever Instagram says they ought to look like, and then the actual needs underneath, like, keep those hidden, and they're not really welcome. And so I think, for one, that feels like, for me, where some of the apologizing comes from, and I totally get the
Yeah.
gender aspect. Let's dive into that a little later, for sure. But also, I think that that's like a huge part of it. Goes back to what we were just talking about, where when we get together and we write and we say it out loud, like, this is who I am, this is what I carry, this is what I feel or think. Um, it's this act of subverting that pressure to, like, not, be real about what we need. What
Yes, that's
what
true.
what
Yeah.
about like, in your own writing? Because you've written. How do you say you've written one memoir or two at this point? Uh,
That's a good question.
it, Either way,
In a way, three, because even
yeah,
my writing manuals had
yeah,
lots and lots of personal stories. So, I mean, I don't think there's anything I write that isn't memoir in one way or another, even if that's not the official title. Yeah, I kind of think of my last one as one, even though it was two different books. I think of it as one memoir. Yeah.
Either way, and I'm excited to read the new version. And I think that the personal stories are what make the writing manual so effective too. With all of that, no matter what number you put on it, you've put yourself out there a lot, and you've published so much of your own personal writing. So how have you, as a writer, not as a teacher observing people in your class, how have you dealt with that yourself? The impulse to like compare yourself to other writers, or be judgmental of your work.
Well, that's what makes me understand why everyone else feels that way. And it's also why I started teaching this kind of workshop, because the world is so brutal. And in a lot of circumstances, the writing world can be pretty brutal. Traditional writing workshops, um, it's there's a lot of focus on what isn't working in the story,
Yeah.
what needs to make it better. It's a lot of kind of tearing it apart. And I just noticed over the years of doing that kind of workshop how painful it was and how well it really didn't work for me to be like torn apart. I think that's our MO all the time anyway. And I think I had a breaking moment with a mentor that I really looked up to and respected and loved her writing. And she was very old school, kind of hardcore old school. And I gave her a piece to read that I was writing, hoping to publish. And she got back to me and she said, Valley, this wasn't even a first draft.
Mm.
And that was like, oh, and that was kind of a breaking point where I thought I will never use that tactic with another writer
Mm.
ever, because um it's so deflating, and it can really just take one or two negative comments for somebody to put down their pen and never write again, especially for kids, in those early stages of development. And I'm still just not great with um, criticism. I like constructive feedback, but when something's taken as a critique, and I've had a lot of mean or demeaning things said about my writing over the years, or at least I processed it that way. And I carried them like huge rocks and big weight, and felt like everything I was doing was trying to kind of prove myself as better than that. So I realized I had to come up with a writing strategy that was going to make me not hate writing
Yeah.
and not be terrified of it and not have it always be about trying to prove my worth. But so that was kind of a long way around your question. But I can still often write something and be like, oh my God, this is so bad. And there will be people in my class who've written these things where I'll like, and it's so amazing. And then I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I have to read this. But I try to model, not apologizing, and model my advice to let whatever comes come, and it doesn't have to be good. And so I just read anyway.
Yeah, I think it works. I mean, I think that the way that you model it works for me. One thing that's definitely like picked up in my own writing practice since writing with Life in Tin is just like a reverence for showing up and doing it and having it be the process. And there are things I write that like I'm totally in love with, and I'm like, this was wonderful. And then there's lots that I write that I'm like, I think I had to sort of like do this in order to
Oh
get to the
yeah.
good stuff.
Oh yeah, there's so much of that.
Yeah.
There's so much of that. I think within each of us, the stuff we have to kind of wade through and dig through, but there's no other way to get to the material that's at the bottom
Yeah.
other than to go straight through. And
Yeah.
I often think of those pieces as bridge pieces. It's
Hmm.
something we have to walk across to get to the other side. But they could also be tunnel pieces, where we're
Sometimes.
tunneling under. I think tunnel pieces would be a good name for it too. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that happens just probably 80% of my writing is a tunnel or a bridge.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then like,
It's a constant practice, right?
oh
It's like
yeah,
just showing up to sort of like put your pen on the paper and see what happens. Um,
exactly.
what about do you So apart from your writing, apart from what you publish or you read in class, do you carry any self-consciousness around just like being public about yourself, having some number of people like know your life story or like hear your constant reflections?
It's definitely been a process over time. I mean, I would say it was terrifying, terrifying, terrifying at first. And it's gotten a little bit easier each time because um although so it's a double-edged. On the one hand, being vulnerable is always vulnerable.
Mm,
It's not like you can't really get immune to being vulnerable in a certain way, or else it means you're not really being vulnerable. Does that make sense? But on the other hand, maybe you just get used to the practice. And so it's still vulnerable, but I'm like, I'm not going to die because I'm vulnerable. In
yeah.
fact, I'm going to get better and I'm going to be happier. And it's just happened over and over and over again that people relate. The more vulnerable it is, the more people actually relate to it. So I'm always trying to take one layer off of what I'm writing, like one layer of protection. And
Right.
sometimes I can't get there. Sometimes it still has, several layers of protection around it, but I try to get underneath.
Has it had any kind of like what has the impact been on your family life, on having two other family members that know you're
Oh,
writing about what's going
yeah.
on under that roof?
Oh yeah. Well, a long time ago, Stan said to me, I always knew I was going to marry a writer. I mean, like he knew that way before we met. And also he said, I just give you kind of carte blanche permission to write anything you need to write. Just don't hold back. Okay.
Wow.
So he said that. On the other hand, there have been times where somebody has picked up like an article I've read, maybe in a coffee shop that he hadn't read, and then come back and talk to him about it. And he's like, what the hell?
Yeah. Right.
Well, this one particular one was I wrote about like what fucked up financial situation we were in. And I wrote about it for Bell magazine, and one of his friends read it and was like, hey, I didn't know y'all. So, and Stan was like, oh my God. And so that did teach me when I write about him, I do forward it to him
Yeah.
now and
Yeah.
say, is this okay? And he has never said no. I think he just wants to kind of be given a little bit of a heads up.
Yeah.
Um, and he hasn't read my books. So that's fine. So I can, that kind of that's a real great safety
Yeah.
that I just don't think he has or ever will read them. And my son, Henry, who's 18 now, does not want to and really doesn't plan to read my books.
Wow.
Yeah.
I that I've never stopped to consider that like I aspire to write a book at some point, to put my writing together into a book. Um, I've never stopped to consider that the family members might just not read them. And maybe that'd be for the best. I don't know.
It is. Oh,
Yeah.
hope that you can find more and more people who will not read your book. The
Uh-huh.
more people who don't read it, the better off you are.
Mm,
Yeah. And at one point, I don't know, maybe he was 6 or 7 or 8. And moms are always posting about their kids on Facebook. And one day Henry said, you can't do that anymore. You can't post about me. And I had to respect his request.
yeah.
And so what happens is I'll write about him for myself because I have to as his mother, but I don't share it. I don't share it. There are things with my husband and I that I might never share. I might not.
Yeah.
But there are things happen. I don't share everything, in other words.
Right.
It has become very clear to me over time that I do have relationships that are more important than my writing.
Yeah. Yeah. I try like there's times where I need to sit down and write about whatever comes to my mind. And the
Exactly.
most personal version of that, the purest version of that is in my own personal journal. That for me
Mhm.
is like separate from what I write in class. But there's times in class too where like I need to go pretty real
Same.
But
Yeah,
I've started to learn that there's a difference when it comes to pressing publish and sharing it with a broader audience. There's a big difference between subjects that I'm looking at in retrospect and have maybe done some healing around, or have like
absolutely.
put some of my learning to the test, versus like
Right.
actively processing.
Oh, it's so true. It's
Yeah.
so, so true. And so I've written about some really, really rough times Stan and I have had where neither of us look good,
Yeah.
but with the perspective of healing and the
Yeah.
perspective of we did make it through, because this is one of the trickiest subjects for any nonfiction writer, I think, how we write about other people.
Yeah.
And there have been pieces that my mom has read and been pretty upset over. And even like you can't predict how someone will react, because I thought I had drawn her in this very beautiful way. And I was shocked how much she hated it and
Mm,
felt like I was telling things that were not mine to tell.
yeah.
And you know, as someone's child, I kind of just, her life was my life. Like I didn't have a really good separation. Like if I experienced it and knew about it, it was my life. So figuring that out is hard. And some people say, I don't care. I am going to write it and let the chips fall where they may. And it often in those cases, I feel like people have had very destructive family relationships, and severing those cords is actually going to be more healthy for them
Right.
than trying to
Right.
keep those cords attached. Um, but I tell my mom that I have a big book to write about her after she dies. And I
I
do.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. I
I
mean, I
do.
you and I share that in common, in that we both have a parent that has left this world. And what I can write about my dad now that he's on the other side is
Yeah.
just different. And for me, there's been a whole lot of like, I sure am glad that I stumbled upon this part of myself, this line of thinking, this feeling after he died, because
Oh
this could have been
gosh,
really
yeah.
rough if it had happened while he was still alive.
I know.
It,
Yeah.
you also raise a good point that is something for me to chew on for my life moving forward, which is like the difference between writing about a parent, but writing about your parent and your child. With your
Oh
parent,
yeah.
it's a little bit more like, you were an adult and like, sorry, but you brought me into this world and put me through a life, and
Right.
now, but like with a child, it's like you have a different kind of responsibility to them.
Absolutely. I agree with that 100%. And in the memoir where I did include Henry, it was times when he was very young, and it was,
Right.
there was no way to include his it's just precious.
Yeah.
It's just really, and luckily I did have a very precious child. There weren't a lot of things I had to,
Yeah.
I could just tell the truth but kind of leave it when he was in that kind of pre-consciousness state,
Right.
before he became kind of, his, and I didn't include anything about him that I think would be revealing really at all. But I
Yeah.
do feel differently about my parents.
Right. So
Yeah.
one more question about that before we shift a little bit. I mean, I have seen recent, within the last 6 months, newsletters from you that have either mentioned like a little bit about your feelings on Henry growing up, or his concert, or
Yeah.
and his album's great, by the way.
Oh,
Um, and there's one more I remember. Oh, he made some remarks to you about the war in Ukraine and like how he might respond should there be
oh
more like
wow. Yeah.
American involvement. And so with those, is that do you go to him and ask for explicit permission?
Absolutely.
Mm,
Each one of
cool.
those I was given permission to share. Yep.
Yeah. Mm,
Yeah, absolutely. But one thing that I will add about dads, because like your dad, my dad died in the not too distant past.
yeah.
And it was after his death that I really was able to, like, the memoir came through me in this nonstop, like tsunami kind of
Mm,
way. Um, and that's why the first issue was like 550 billion pages. I mean, the first edition of that book,
sure.
because it was the wave and the flood of that. But I had done quite a bit of writing about him before he died. And there was one particular piece that I was going to publish. So I wanted him to read it first. And it was very painful for him.
Mm, mm,
And I one of the last things I've ever wanted to do in my entire life was hurt my dad, but it also meant keeping a lot of truth away from my dad.
Yeah.
So in a way, in this sharing, it was like giving him a glimpse into the truth of me. And so I don't regret that. I don't
Yeah.
regret that. He kind of had a better picture of how my childhood went than
Yeah.
he did before he read it, or my perspectives on that. And so I think there was an opportunity for healing through that, because we were able to have conversations. And I feel like by the time he died, we were very clean.
Mm.
We were very clear. We had washed a lot out. So I am glad I had the opportunity to share one piece with him that was painful. We never want to hurt somebody. I don't think, especially somebody we love and cherish so much, but it was about getting real. It was about
Yeah.
being honest. That's the kind of writing I do.
Yeah. Right. And thanks for bringing all that up. I mean, I think that gets at such a central question, which is like, how can we hold our conflict with one another lovingly? And
Yeah.
like
Oh,
on the surface, there's like, if you and I have plans and you blow me off, like, how can I be like, Valley, that hurt my feelings, and we had decided to meet at noon and you didn't show up. And deeper than that, it's like, these parent-child relationships where like I recognize that you were doing your best. I recognize that you had a certain amount of tools and coping mechanisms, and then you were kind of thrown out into the world just like every other human. And you made decisions that still hurt and that scarred me. And how can we bear witness to that, be truthful about that, and also not draw this fence around it that says like we can't love each other through
yeah,
that as well?
absolutely. Yeah, so true. Yeah. It's a big topic
It's a big
for
topic.
everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what I've come down to, what it comes down to for me is no censorship, no holding back in your first draft. Write it all, write
Mm.
everything, go crazy, do the tell all, but then use a very different part of your brain when you're making decisions about what to publish and what to put
Yeah,
out into the world.
that makes sense. So what's like an ongoing inquiry for you in your writing? For me, for example, that desire to both be honest about what I'm feeling and compassionate toward the actors at play is like a very alive question. Um,
Yeah.
is there anything like that that's sort of like front and center for you with your own thought process and writing these days?
Yeah, actually, spent years and years and years and years processing the past and all of the situations that I'd lived through, experiences I had had, heartbreak, suffering, insanity, all this stuff, and spent a lot of time writing through those stories. And when I kind of felt like exorcised of those stories, not that they're ever really going to go away, they'll always be there in some way, but they're not my big thing anymore. And when
Mm,
I've made a lot of peace, I've made a lot of amends. There's not a lot of drama. I don't have relationships that feel like severed or painful at the moment. There's a lot more peace than there's ever been, and that's what scared me.
wow,
What do I have to write about now?
totally.
What do I have to write about now that, like, okay, I like where I live, we're healthy,
Yeah.
I'm not like, chaos, drama queen, and there's not like violent, crazy changes happening all the time. What do you do when the dust settles? And so that's been my biggest exploration the last couple of years, I'd say.
And what are you finding?
Well, it's sure pushing me out of my trajectory that I had been on for a long time. And so I'm really in the kind of, it's true exploration all the
Yeah.
time. Like, how can I go deeper into what seems, I used to be so terrified of the word boring. And I
Yeah, you
don't
said that.
really believe in the word boring anymore. Now it's like that you just have to peel back more layers. It's not all on top. It's not all this big drama plot on top. It's more going into your own consciousness
Mhm.
and deeper into your psyche and kind of behind the scenes of what we see, and the smaller moments become bigger. We're not having to concentrate on like the Mount Everest. We're writing about like, the grass in our front yard,
Mhm.
and going deeper and deeper into that. And I found it to be really quite a beautiful process. Yeah.
So is it, in your mind, is it about finding these like maybe smaller but still existent points of tension or conflict or pain, or do you believe inherently that like there is interest and value in being creative around the joy as well?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I definitely have been a pain addict most of my life
Yeah,
and just been accustomed to it. Like, and what else is interesting? Like,
right.
nothing else is interesting except like your suffering and my suffering. And that, as that's been healing in me, I've had to stretch into accepting joy and writing about joy and writing about finding peace. Not to say, oh my God, I never want to come across as like, I don't have big internal conflict, um, confusion, the unknown, interpersonal stuff, because I do, of course, but none of it is as high stakes as it used to
Yeah,
be.
yeah,
But when I sit down to write, I really try to go in and find what feels biggest right now. Like, what's the thing that's really been kind of flaring up throughout the week, since I write a piece every Friday? And sometimes it is something painful or something that I'm still have a lot of unknowns about, or something unresolved, or sharing just my shortcomings. That's one kind of topic that I like to go along those lines, like how I'm overeating or overspending or being an asshole, or things like that.
hmm,
um but I have started to give myself permission in my life and in my writing to experience and explore joy.
yeah,
And it's still relatively new, but I'm planning to keep heading in that direction.
yeah. Right on. Well, I'm rooting for you in that because
That's hopeful. That's
it,
hopeful.
yeah. I mean, it's just it's relatable to sort of feel, and you hear people talk about it all the time with like, when the songwriter sobers up or whatever, like are songs
Right.
interesting anymore? And I feel that with myself, like so much of the fuel for what I write and what I think people relate to does have its roots in the difficulty. And
Yeah.
there's this notion that like, well, if I one day, sort of like have resolved things in a way that maybe I'm not quite there yet, like what am I going to have to write about?
Yes.
Um, and I, you know, I can both relate to like to saying like I'm sure there will be plenty remaining to write about, and
Right.
also, you know, there is value in creating from a place of joy or gratitude or love.
Yeah. And I think for the rest of our lives, it will be a mixed bag.
Of
Like
course.
maybe I'm aiming towards joy for once, but there's going to be everything else that comes along the way.
Yeah.
So, I mean, at least though the compass is pointed in a different direction, I'm not trying to follow my own horror quite as much.
Yeah, that makes
Still
sense.
creeps in for sure, but it's just not, that's not my, like what I'm, that's not my destination.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe being guided a little bit less by like open wounds versus like
Exactly.
scars.
Yeah,
Um,
that's so true. Yeah.
yeah. Well, sort of related to that, another topic that you and I have talked about a little bit, and you get into in your own writing, and it comes up a lot in class. Why? What is it about life in 10 that retracts a lot of folks who are in recovery? Um, you
Yeah.
know, it, and I asked that out of, personally, I come from a place of just a lot of like respect and reverence for anytime I hear someone talk about their experience in 12 steps to me. And I have some very close friends who have shared with me about that. And to me, it just stands out as like it's hard to it's like you're either showing up and doing it or you're not, is how it can feel, at least from like my perspective. I'm just wondering if you could share anything about that.
Yeah, I think 12-step people often in class sort of have that advantage of being more experienced in sharing vulnerably in a group,
Mm,
because that's what happens in 12-step meetings. You share kind of about your pain, your suffering, your fuck ups, what you're trying to do, the direction you're trying to go in. And you're just sharing very openly in a group of strangers. And in a way, that is very much what we do in class, except we're writing and reading. And there's not just one theme, of course, it couldn't be about anything. But 12-step people have probably a little more practice in doing that than other people.
yeah. Do you, both with your own writing and with students, like, do you see a difference between writing as kind of like ongoing maintenance of sobriety, or even if we expand this out of just talking about substances or alcohol, like ongoing struggle and again, like tension with it, effort to like sort of like stay on top of the goal versus reflective, like I have arrived at some kind of point, maybe I'm more stable than I used to be. um I've just noticed that with some artists that I'm into that have like sang about their own recovery process.
Yeah. So the recovery process never ends. It's not like, at least in my experience, it's not like I'm recovered and
Yeah,
I'll never, because I just have an addictive personality through and through. So whatever it is, whether it's a substance, a person, a thing, a feeling, whatever. So I'm always in the recovery process. So I can be writing about past experience or present experience. And
yeah,
it's just might not always be the same addictive substance, but the feelings can be the same.
yeah,
The obsession can be the same. The way that it, kind of invades your life can be similar. So to
yeah,
me, it's just an ongoing. I mean, I might find that I have some recovery in some areas, but wow, I'm opening up this whole new can of worms over here,
yeah,
because we can be very creative that way. Yeah.
yeah. That, I mean, that makes sense. And again, that's something that I've enjoyed about being part of Life in 10 is just how many different aspects of myself come out in my writing
Yeah.
class, and how it doesn't really fit into a single narrative or a single vantage point, but rather like some of it's really active, like this is what's ongoing, and some of this is me looking
Mhm.
back. And
Oh, yeah.
yeah. Mm. Do you find that people show up to class with, because, okay, let me rephrase this. I place an expectation of myself sometimes to show up to class and like write about something big or important. And I think that's partly because like that's like what I'm dealing with in my life right now. Like, I've had some really big changes, death of a parent, marriage, all
Mhm.
that stuff. What kind of pressure do you think people put on themselves to like produce something really good? I mean, we're kind of going back to what we talked about at the beginning, but
Generally a lot,
yeah,
a lot of pressure.
yeah,
Well, so I have students who've been taking my class consistently for 10 years.
yeah,
And I think at this
it's cool.
point, they're just like, I'll show up and just trust that whatever needs to come will come. So, it's that process of over time learning to let go of that need to control and just allowing the process to happen. But very often there are people who try to plan each thing they're going to write before they come. And almost every time they forget what it was and they
Hmm.
start writing, or they remember what it was and something completely different happens anyway.
Yeah,
Um, and I think, in your case, and when there are circumstances that are really big and kind of clear, like I'm writing about my dad, my marriage, it's not just this big, ambiguous unknown, then that really does give you kind of this path that you're going to continue returning to. Even if you don't stay on it for every writing, It's like something that you're going to weave around.
Yeah.
And in some cases, people don't have a very clear, like, this is what's happening right now that I need to process. They just don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But I think people, yeah, generally we want it to be good. We want it to make sense. We want it to be big. We want it to be amazing and sell 1 billion copies after our first draft. But, I think this is a process of unlearning
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. 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 And getting together with a bunch of people who are also open to the
Uh,
unlearning and like
yeah.
doing it a little differently. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Um, one more kind of like umbrella topic, and I'll start by just asking you, what percentage of your students, if you were to take a guess, are women?
98%.
Okay.
Maybe 97.5%. I don't know.
uh, well, as one of
Yeah.
the 2.5%, I mean, that makes me laugh because that tracks with my experience as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
Is it
Yeah.
common that a man joins your class and is like a one-off and doesn't come back?
It's really varied. It kind of depends on what class it is. Like for a long time, I had a Tuesday night class, which was some really powerful kick-ass women.
Yeah.
They were big energy, big stories, and a man, like no man ever made it through an entire session. I think they were just super intimidated and like they thought maybe this would be a little more craft oriented or a little
Uh-huh.
more like they weren't ready for the big inside, like divine feminine, this is my big story and I own it. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just guessing, but
Sure, sure.
not a lot of men made it through that. But then I've had men who I think are really special, like yourself, and are really open to the process of getting vulnerable, writing about feelings, listening to other people write about feelings, writing about growth, and um, who have been stick and stayers. I do have a few men who've really over time shown up consistently, or even just consistently for a few sessions or a
Mhm.
few years.
Do you
And I
think,
think that's great.
yeah, I mean, do you think of vulnerability and sharing and sort of like tapping feelings? Do you think of those as feminine qualities?
Not inherently.
Yeah,
I mean, I think that we are definitely like raised in such a way that it mostly shows up in the feminine.
yeah,
But I don't think that, I mean, I think if when men were little boys, they were given modeled by other men, if they were
yeah,
given examples of that kind of modeling, and then we would have a lot more sensitive, um, accustomed to being vulnerable, showing up in writing classes and for therapy, and
yeah,
to do this kind of work, there would be a lot more men.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that your note, for one, I would be super curious to go back in time and try that Tuesday night group we used to do and like see if I'm curious, like could I hang?
Could you think?
Uh,
I think you could. I think you
yeah,
could. I mean, just from the start, the look on their, it was like,
yeah,
before it even
yeah,
really got rolling. And then
yeah.
when somebody would talk about their period or whatever, they'd be just like,
I'm
"Ding."
out. Yeah, yeah. I do think there's something to the like strength in numbers thing too, where like if 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 a guy is sort of, and this is speaking in general terms, but if a guy
Yeah.
is like put on the stage and be like, write openly and then share, it can be hard. But if there's other men in the room that are doing the same thing,
Yeah.
some of the work I do beyond my writing classes, some of the more discussion based like workshops, it's remarkable to me, number one, how difficult it can be to get men in the door for this kind of
Right.
work, but then how quickly those walls come down and guys are like, oh, like you have a story about how your dad ridiculed you,
Yeah.
in front of a bunch of other guys when you were 7 and you've never forgotten. It's interesting. I have a story about, you know, the time I wanted to get my ear pierced and my dad was like, I'll never speak to you if you do that, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
um those stories are there for guys too. Obviously, they're there for guys too.
Yeah, you're so right. Like, if you feel like you're the only one in a room in whatever capacity, I think it's why we have a teacher right now teaching the Sisters Gather writing Black
Yeah,
books.
no, yeah,
And it's a really wonderful place for Black women to come and to be able to write without having to make any considerations or thought of a white person in the room.
right.
Women write differently when it's all women. I'm sure men write differently when it's all men. I think the LGBTQ community really benefits from having some spaces where, that are completely safe and everyone can relate. And so there are benefits to finding your likeness
Yeah,
and being able to relate in that way. And then there are also huge benefits in gathering people from all
yep,
different sectors and putting them in the room together. And each one has its different pros.
yeah, yeah. Yes, as you started that thought, my mind went to the same place of there being like really big upsides to both.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
true.
Well, it's always interesting to hear your little anecdotes about men who've joined over the years because um I love when I can get in a group of other guys who want to share.
Yeah.
And I definitely still carry like it's easier for me to be open and vulnerable and talk about my feelings around women than it is for men still.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. You know, so I taught one class of all women. My very, very first class of adults ever was women. And then so for my next session, a man signed up and I completely flipped out. I was like, what am I going to do?
Yeah.
There's a man in the class. Like, I really felt like it was as if a Martian had come to Earth and signed up for my writing class. It was like, but, that very first night, I was like, oh, man equals human.
Yeah.
I mean, and God, what a learning experience for me.
Yeah.
I mean, what judgment and craziness I had around really just trying to accept men in a completely different way than I had before. And now I'm always excited when there's a man. What an opportunity here to learn about each other, um, to open our understanding of humanity, all of these things.
Yeah. Cool. Well, that I'm going to use your those words, opening understanding of humanity, as maybe transition us toward wrapping up. Like I've it's been well over a year at this point since I've been writing with you, and my understanding of humanity in terms of myself and of other people has only grown. I love being a part of the Life in 10 community. I love showing up to class, week in and week out and seeing what comes out. It really is like a really special part of my life. And I know I'm not alone when I say that. Um,
Oh,
so,
thank
uh, yeah, yeah. And with that, like, I guess we're wrapped up on the inaugural podcast. Unless, is there anything else you want to throw
you.
out there?
No, I think that was awesome. I
Cool.
mean, I did think of a lot of other things that would be really fun to talk about at some point, but for today, perfect.
Yeah, cool. Well
Yeah.
then, cut.